In this lecture, we'll explore firewall rules. A firewall typically establishes a barrier between a trusted internal network and an untrusted external network, such as the internet. The Google Cloud Firewall rules let you allow or deny traffic to and from a virtual machine instance based on a configuration that you specify. Every VPC network functions as a distributed firewall. Firewall rules are defined at the network level, but the connections are allowed or denied on a per-instance basis. You can think of the GCP firewall rules as existing not only between the instances and other networks, but also between individual instances within the same network. Every VPC network has two implied firewall rules. These rules exist but are not shown in the Cloud Console. There is the implied allow egress rule, an egress rule whose action is allow and the destination is 0.0.0.0. The priority for this is the lowest and lets any instance and traffic to any destination except for traffic blocked by GCP. Then there is the implied deny ingress rule. This is an ingress rule whose action is to deny and the source is 0.0.0.0. The priority for this is also the lowest priority, and it protects all instances by blocking incoming traffic to them. The implied rules cannot be changed. You can't override them with a higher priority rule. Let's look at some basic concepts. GCP always blocks certain traffic. Your firewall rules cannot be used to allow any of this type of traffic. GRE traffic. All sources and destinations, whether the source or destination is an internal IP address or an external IP address, GRE traffic is not allowed. Protocols other than TCP, UDP, ICMP, AH, ESP, and SCT to external IP addresses to Google Cloud resources are blocked. Depending on the type of resource you use, there might be even more of a limitation. For example, if you use a network TCP UDP load balancer, that only supports TCP and UDP. And then egress traffic to TCP destination port 25, which is the SMTP email port, is also blocked. And this is traffic from instances to an external IP address to the internet and instances to external IP addresses of the instances itself. Always allowed traffic. Now this traffic is always allowed in GCP. That's DHCP, DNS name resolution, internal DNS and cloud DNS, instance metadata, and the NTP, which is the network time protocol. Google runs a local metadata server alongside with each instance. This metadata server runs at 169.254.169.254. This is important for the operation of the instance, so the instance can be accessed regardless of any firewall rules that you may configure. The firewall rules only support IP version 4 traffic. Each rule either allows or denies and applies to incoming, which is the ingress, and outgoing, egress. You can't create a rule for both at the same time. And finally, firewall rules are stateful. Once a connection is established, then all the other subsequent traffic will flow. There are some predefined rules, which are pre-populated with these firewall rules. The default network contains a few firewall rules that are pre-populated. These rules can be deleted or modified as necessary. There is a default allow internal, so this allows ingress connections from all protocols and ports among instances in the same network. This rule has the second to lowest priority, and it effectively permits incoming connections to VM instances from others in the same network. The default allow SSH. This allows ingress traffic to port 22. Default allow RDP. This is for remote desktop protocol. and this allows ingress connections to TCP port 3389. And finally, the default allow ICMP, and this allows ingress ICMP traffic from any source in the network. The maximum number of connections that can be logged per VM instance depends on the machine type. The connection logging limits are expressed as a maximum number of connections that can be logged in a 5-second interval. So you can see that if you have a shared core machine, then it's 130K stateful connections. Machines for 1 to 8 vCPUs, then it's per vCPU you have 130K connections. And if you have more than 8 vCPUs, then you can have more than 1 million connections. When you're creating a firewall rule, there are some components. There's a priority, action, enforcement, target, source destination, and the protocols and ports. The priority is an integer from 0 to 65535. The default priority is 1000. The action is allow or deny. Remember, you can't have both. The enforcement is you want to enable the rule or not. The target is a target parameter that specifies the source and destination. Instances in the VPC network, service accounts, and network tag, source, destination. Target. The target defines the instances, including GKE clusters and App Engine flexible environments to which the rule applies. The source destination is any network or a specific range of IP version 4 addresses. The default is 0.0.0.0. And protocols and ports are the protocols such as TCP, UDP, ICMP, and the port that you want to apply the rule for. Firewall rules logging allows you to audit, verify, and analyze the effects of firewall rules. For example, you can determine if a firewall rule designated to deny traffic is functioning correctly or not. Firewall rules logging is also useful if you need to determine how many connections are affected by a given firewall rule. You can enable firewall rules logging individually for each firewall rule. When you enable a firewall rule logging for a specific firewall rule, then GCP creates an entry called the connection record each time the rule allows or denies traffic. This can get really large and you get charged for this storage. This is why it's disabled by default. You can export these logs to cloud logging, PubSub, or BigQuery for analysis. The connection record contains the source and destination IP address, the protocol and ports, date and time, and a reference to the firewall rule that applied to the traffic. You can only enable firewall rules logging for rules in VPC networks. The legacy networks are not supported. They only record TCP and UDP connections. You can't enable the firewall rules logging for the implied deny and the implied allow rules. And the log entries are written from the perspective of the virtual machine instances. So the log entries are only created if a firewall rule has logging enabled and if the rule applies to traffic sent or from a virtual machine. You can use service accounts to create firewall rules that are more specific in nature. So for both ingress and egress rules, you can use service accounts to specify targets. For the ingress rules, you can also specify the source for incoming packets as a primary internal IP address of any VM in the network where the VM uses a particular service accounts. If you want to use this feature, the service account must be created before you create a firewall rule. You can use a network tag in the place of a service account. A network tag is an arbitrary attribute. So one or more network tags can be associated with an instance by any Cloud IAM member who has permission to change it. Whereas a service account represents an identity associated with an instance, and only one service account can be associated with an instance. So this provides a much more stricter access control because the service account user role has to be granted to other Cloud IAM members in order to impersonate the service account. Whereas for a network tag, it can be any Cloud IAM member who has access to that virtual machine is able to make these changes.
For more details, check the link in the description. Learn with Whizlabs. Success certified.